What is communication? So, what do you think of when you think of communication? One thing to consider is that communication is a process, it's continuous and it's ongoing. Anytime we have a conversation with someone else, be it via text or be it verbally, uh, that conversation has, generally speaking anyway, some prior history and it will be communicated in the future. In other words, if I'm talking to my son now, in the future, that process will be continued. It's relational, it's not individual, it depends on the involvement of others. It's also symbolic. And what that means is that communication is arbitrary. In this case, the word arbitrary could mean a yellow flower, often construed as a weed. Um, what I'm getting at there is this, is that when we're communicating, what we think we are saying to someone else may not be what is received. Um, for the purpose of this course, there are two models of communication. The first is linear, and when we think of linear model of communication, basically communication goes in one direction. I speak, you listen, that's it. The second model is a transactional one. It's the one that is more accurate in several respects. You can see from the model there are messages. Those messages are decoded. People respond. There is feedback going both directions. One thing to keep in mind is that not only is the communication either expressed, either verbally or, for example, via text or email, but there are also communication with ourselves. So things are going on in our own head while we're talking to other people. There are several different types of communication. The first, as I just talked about, is intrapersonal communication. The voices in our head. Some of us have more voices than others, I guess. Um, this is important to think about. We're constantly having a dialogue with ourselves as we are sitting there thinking, and also we are having a dialogue when we're talking to other people. So, for example, in the second type of communication, dyadic or interpersonal communication, that's when I'm talking to one other person. And while I'm speaking or communicating with that person in a time when I am not communicating, of course, there are things going through my own head. The third type of communication is small group communication. I might imagine 3 or 4 people going out. Something to think about is, generally speaking, in small group communication, one person generally emerges as a leader. Some other people will take a step back, and so that's the way small groups communicate. There's organizational communication, the kind that you see in business. It could be via email. It can be face to face. It might be come in the form of a campus-wide business meeting. Um, Public communication, kind of CVTC, we will send emails or we'll send press releases to the public. And then finally, there is mass communication, the kind that you might see on the internet. When talking about communication, one important thing, and something that has changed over the years, obviously, is social media. And a couple questions to think about with social media are: how often do you communicate via social media, and how much time do you spend? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad, but it is a good idea to balance this kind of communication with face to face time. With social media, you should respect privacy and you should be civil and mindful of others and their needs. So it's easy in social media to act more aggressively or act in a way that really doesn't reflect our true personality because you can get away with it. It's important to be cautious and choose the best medium. And the last thing to consider with social media is to keep in mind that other people are watching. One example that I give in class all the time is your Facebook page, and a lot of times people's Facebook page will have a lot of photos or conversation or both about partying, for example. And so there might be 10 pictures of somebody taking shots. Now, it's a good idea always probably to block people that you don't want to see your information in the first place with Facebook. But in this case instance, it's probably even better idea, particularly when you go for employment, to make sure your Facebook page is cleaned up in a way that is not going to affect your prospective employment. For better or worse, people oftentimes cruise Facebook pages, for example, one example, and something that they see as negative could affect you. You think about the functions of communication. We have physical needs. It's necessary for physical health. human beings are meant to interact, and without that, you can have isolationism. If you think of people who are depressed, oftentimes one thing they do is withdraw from other people, which of course is probably one of the worst things you could do when you're depressed, but it's a natural reaction. Communication also functions, it serves to help us learn who we are. So our identity is made known through communication with other people. There are also social needs, which are obvious, um, inclusion, pleasure, and then, of course, control of others. So communication is, and I will say this more than once, is neither good nor bad, being a good communicator. And sometimes good communicators are able to control other people, and that's one reason that we communicate a certain way. And then, of course, there are practical needs, much like this informative and highly entertaining lecture. So when you think about effective communication, there's no ideal way to communicate. Some ways work better than others for some people. Some people are more effusive. Some people are a little more less likely to talk a lot, but you can be an effective communicator either way. It's situational. In other words, the way that I speak if I'm with my friends playing trivia on Tuesday night is not the same way that I communicate with my students or if I were at a conference in Chicago. It's relational. Communication is a transaction. What works with one person will not be effective with others. A good example of this is that I will coach little kids in basketball a lot of times, and every fourth grader is not the same in the way that you communicate with them. Some of them you can be more direct and say, hey, you need to box out, and others need to be encouraged more because they take it more personally. And so good communicators understand the differences in people. To that, competence can be learned, at least to a point. And I think that competence, learning that competence, really comes with self-awareness. What am I saying? How is it being received? And can I modify that to be a more effective communicator? When you think about characteristics of competent communicators, um, they can choose from a wide range of behaviors. And they can choose the most appropriate behavior. They also have skill at performance. So good communicators are often good performers. Going with that, they have empathy or perspective taking. So they can look at another person and put themselves in their shoes. They are self aware so they can see how they're coming across to that person. They're able to construct a variety of frameworks for viewing an issue. So if you take the example of being a teacher, if I explain how to write an essay to 10 students, 7 or 8 of them might understand the way I normally do it very easily, and another 2 or 3 might require a different approach. Competent communicators also have a commitment to the relationship. They care that about communicating with the other person. And as noted, they have self-monitoring, they have self-awareness. Now, if you think about all those things, good communicators doesn't necessarily make them great people, because a lot of times people have all these skills, but really they're just using it for manipulation. And it's something to think about when dealing with other people and when evaluating how other people communicate with you. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about misconceptions. Communication does not always require complete understanding. So if you think about how you influence other people, it's not necessary that you understand them completely, but that you try to understand them and that you work on your communication. Communication does not, however, solve all problems. And it's important to understand that though I communicate something, it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation will be resolved. Communication is neither good nor bad, as I've said. A good communicator can use it for good or for ill as they see fit. Meanings rest in people, not words. What you think you are saying is not always what is heard. That could be the fault of the person that you're talking to, or it could be yours, or it could be a combination of those things, but it's something to be aware of. Communication isn't simple, and sometimes less is more. If you've ever had an argument with a spouse, sometimes, a little bit of communication and a lot of listening is a good idea, or maybe just come back and communicate at a later time. And the last thing to think about is, do you consider yourself a good communicator? Why or why not?